There is a bar of it in your bathroom. Or a bottle. You used it today, probably several times, without thinking once. It costs almost nothing. It is in every home on Earth, every hotel, every hospital, every public toilet in every country. And the recipe for it is older than the alphabet, older than the pyramids. We have it written down on clay from 4,500 years ago. Fat, ash, water. That is it. That is the whole thing. So here's the question. If soap is that old, and that simple, and that cheap, why did nobody wash with it? Not for a while, not for centuries, for thousands of years. The Sumerians had soap. They did not bathe in it. The Babylonians had soap. Same. The Egyptians had something like it. Same. And Rome? Rome was obsessed with bathing. Enormous public baths. Aqueducts built to fill them. Hours spent inside them every day. A civilization that took cleanliness seriously. And they did it, almost entirely. Without soap, they knew it existed. They wrote about it. They imported it. And they used it on their hair. To dye it, not to clean themselves. So what did they use? Oil. You poured oil on your skin, rubbed it in, then scraped it off with a curved metal blade, along with the dirt, and the sweat, and the dead skin. It worked. It genuinely worked. For 1,000 years. Now think about what that means. Soap was not undiscovered. It was not lost. It was not secret. It was sitting there, in the same cities, in the same century, being used for something else entirely. Which is the strangest part of this story. The gap between inventing a thing and working out what it is for, thousands of years wide. And it was not a technical problem. Nobody needed better chemistry. The chemistry was finished. What was missing was a reason. Because here is the thing about washing. You wash to get clean. But what does clean mean? You think you know. You think it means free of germs. That idea is about 150 years old. Everyone before that washed for other reasons. And they washed constantly, ritually, before prayer, before eating, after touching the dead, after illness, after birth. Water was purification, long before it was hygiene. And purification does not need soap. Purification needs the right water, at the right time, with the right words. So the story of soap is not a story about chemistry. It is a story about what people believed dirt was. And every time that belief changed, so did the way they washed. Before we go any further, we need to understand what soap physically does, because the mechanism explains everything else. Start with the problem. Put your hands under water, rub them together, and most dirt comes off perfectly well. Dust, mud, sand, loose debris. Water handles all of it without any help whatsoever. But there is one category of dirt that water cannot touch, and it happens to be the important one. Grease, oil, fat, anything from an animal, a kitchen, or your own skin. Pour water onto oil and nothing happens. They sit beside each other and refuse to mix. Everyone has seen this in a pan, and it is not a small effect. It is absolute. The reason comes down to how the molecules are built, and it is worth 1 minute of your attention. A water molecule has a slight positive charge at one end and a slight negative charge at the other, which means water molecules stick to each other strongly, like tiny magnets in a crowd. Oil molecules have no such charge. They are electrically flat, with nothing for water to grip. So when the two meet, water molecules cling to each other and squeeze the oil out into blobs. The oil is not being repelled. It is being excluded, which is a subtler and more stubborn problem. And this matters enormously because grease is what makes dirt stick to you in the first place. Your skin produces oil continuously. Dust, soot, and bacteria land in it and are held there. So rinsing with water removes the loose material and leaves the greasy film exactly where it was, which is why hands can look clean, feel clean, and still be carrying almost everything that was on them. Now here is what a soap molecule does about that, and it is genuinely elegant. A soap molecule has two ends, and they want completely opposite things. One end is charged and loves water. The other end is a long chain that behaves exactly like oil. It is a molecule that cannot decide what it is, and that indecision is the entire point. Drop soap into greasy water, and the molecules arrange themselves automatically, without any effort from you. The oil-loving tails bury themselves into the grease. The water-loving heads point outward into the water, which wraps each droplet of grease in a shell of molecules that water is happy to hold on to. The grease has not been dissolved or destroyed. It has been packaged, and the packaging is water-friendly. Now it rinses away, carrying everything that was stuck inside it, including the bacteria. And that last part is worth stating clearly, because it is widely misunderstood. Ordinary soap is not primarily a poison. Its main job is not to kill anything. It lifts things off you and carries them down the drain, and that removal is what protects you. Soap does damage many microbes because their outer membranes are partly built of fat, and soap attacks fat. But the core function is mechanical. Wrap, lift, rinse. Nothing more mysterious than that. So how do you make a molecule with two opposite ends, using nothing but what an ancient household already had? You need two ingredients, and both of them were sitting in every kitchen in the ancient world. The first is fat. Animal fat from cooking, rendered from meat, or plant oil where it was available. The second is a strong alkali, and this is where ash comes in. Burn wood, and the remaining ash is rich in certain mineral salts left behind by the tree. Soak that ash in water, and those salts dissolve, producing a sharp, slippery, caustic liquid. This is lye, and people have been making it for a very long time, for many purposes. It stings. It feels soapy on the fingers, and it is strong enough to burn skin if concentrated. Now combine the two, fat and lye together, ideally with heat, and a chemical reaction begins. The alkali breaks the fat molecules apart, and the fragments recombine into exactly the two-ended molecule we described. That reaction has a name, and the name tells you how central soap became. Saponification. The word for the process comes from the word for soap itself, in a family of related European languages. And notice what this means for the invention. You do not need to understand any of the chemistry. You do not need to know about molecules or charges or why oil and water separate. You only need to boil fat with ash water and notice that the result does something useful, which is why soap could be invented thousands of years before anyone could explain it. And it is also why it was probably invented many times, independently, in many different places. Because both ingredients are unavoidable in any settlement that cooks meat over a wood fire. Fat drips. Ash accumulates. Rain falls. The reaction does not require a laboratory or an intention, which brings us to the legend that almost every article about soap repeats, and that you may have heard. The story goes that on a hill called Mount Sapo in Rome, animals were sacrificed and burned. Fat and ash washed down into the river below, where women were doing their laundry. They noticed the clothes came out cleaner in that particular spot, and soap was discovered. It is a wonderful story, and it explains the word beautifully, and it is almost certainly false. There is no hill called Mount Sapo anywhere in the Roman record. The location simply does not exist. The tale appears to be a much later invention, circulated in the 19th century and repeated ever since. Which is a shame, because the real history is stranger and considerably more interesting. Because we do have genuine records of soap, far older than Rome, written down in detail. And what those records say it was for is not what you would expect. Southern Mesopotamia, around 4,500 years ago. Clay tablets, pressed with a reed while still wet, then dried. Most of what survives is administration. Grain received, workers paid, livestock counted, the paperwork of an early state. And among that paperwork sit instructions for mixing substances, including the earliest soap recipes we possess. The ingredients are exactly what the chemistry predicts. A fatty substance combined with an alkaline plant ash. Proportions are given. Quantities are specified. This is not an accident being described. This is a procedure being recorded, which tells us something immediately. By this point, soap was already routine enough to be written into official records. So the actual discovery is older still, sitting somewhere in the long period before anyone could write anything down. Now the important question. What do the tablets say it was for? Textiles. Overwhelmingly, textiles. To understand why, you have to understand what wool was to Mesopotamia, and the scale is easy to underestimate. Textiles were among the primary industries of these cities, and one of their major exports. Enormous workshops employed large numbers of workers, many of them women, processing wool at industrial scale. And raw wool, straight off a sheep, is not a clean material in any sense. It is heavy with natural grease, which coats every fiber and protects the animal from weather. That grease is genuinely useful on a living sheep and completely ruinous in a workshop. It blocks dye. Color will not penetrate a greasy fiber, and dyed cloth was where the money was. It attracts and holds dirt. It makes spinning harder. It leaves the finished cloth smelling of animal. So before wool can become anything valuable, the grease has to come off, completely and reliably. Water alone cannot do it, for exactly the reasons we established earlier. Grease excludes water. which means soap is not a luxury in this industry. Soap is the thing that makes the industry possible, and that reframes the invention entirely. Soap was not a personal product that later found industrial uses. It was an industrial product developed for processing materials that took thousands of years to reach the human body. The second recorded use is medical, and it points in the same direction. Ancient medical texts describe soap-like preparations applied to skin conditions, sores, and wounds. This is treatment, not washing. You applied it to a diseased area the way you would apply an ointment. A healthy person would have had no reason to put it on themselves at all. And that distinction runs through the entire ancient world with remarkable consistency. Soap for cloth. Soap for medicine. Not soap for people. Egypt shows a similar pattern, with its own materials and its own emphasis. Egyptian texts describe cleansing preparations combining animal and vegetable fats with alkaline salts. Natron, a naturally occurring mineral salt deposit, was central to Egyptian life in several ways. It was used in cleaning and famously in mummification, where its drying properties preserved the body. Egyptians did wash their bodies, and priests washed with extraordinary frequency, several times daily. But look at why. Priestly washing was required before approaching a god, and in purity there was a religious category. A priest was not removing bacteria. He was making himself fit to enter a sacred space, which is the pattern we are going to see everywhere once we start looking for it. People washed constantly in the ancient world, and often more thoroughly than people did much later. But washing belonged to religion and to social presentation, not to a theory of disease. And that has a practical consequence which explains the entire mystery of this video. If dirt is a spiritual condition, then water is the correct remedy, and water alone is sufficient. Adding a manufactured chemical does not make you more pure. It may even seem beside the point. So soap sits in the workshop, cleaning wool, while the population washes in water and feels perfectly clean doing it. There is one more factor, and it is entirely practical rather than philosophical. Early soap was harsh. Getting the balance right between fat and alkali is not trivial without measurement. Too much alkali, and the mixture attacks skin, leaving it raw, cracked, and painful. That is acceptable for wool, which does not complain. It is not acceptable for a face. So even where someone tried it on their body, the experience would not have encouraged repetition. Mild soap is a later achievement, requiring better control of ingredients and a great deal of accumulated experience. And there is a third reason, which is simply that people already had a method that worked, because the ancient world was not walking around dirty, waiting for someone to invent proper hygiene. It had a solution to the grease problem, and that solution was itself grease. Which sounds absurd until you understand it, and then it turns out to be genuinely clever. Remember the underlying chemistry. Oil does not mix with water, but oil mixes perfectly with other oil. So if you cannot lift grease off your skin using water, use something that grease is happy to join. Pour fresh oil over your body, and it merges with the old, dirty oil already sitting there. The dirt trapped in that layer becomes suspended in the new oil, loosened from the skin beneath. Then you scrape the whole mixture off, mechanically, and the dirt leaves with it. Fresh oil in, dirty oil out. No soap required, and no chemistry that needs explaining. It sounds strange to modern ears, but it works, and it worked well enough to satisfy an entire civilization. The tool for scraping had a name, and it survives in enormous numbers in the archaeological record. A curved metal blade, usually bronze, shaped to follow the contours of an arm or a leg. Blunt on the edge, so it drags across skin without cutting, and grooved to channel what it collects. They are found across the Roman world in bathhouses, in graves, and in household possessions, often in sets, alongside small flasks for carrying oil, sometimes strung together on a ring. People owned personal ones. They were given as gifts. They appear in art and on tombstones, which tells you this was not a marginal practice. This was the standard technology of getting clean, and it sat at the center of an institution that defined Roman public life more than almost any other. Because Rome did not simply wash. Rome built the act of washing into architecture on a scale that still astonishes. Enormous complexes, free or nearly free to enter, open to almost everyone in the city, and virtually none of it involved soap. A Roman bath complex was not a room with water in it. It was a building program, and often one of the largest in the city. The great imperial baths covered enormous areas and could hold thousands of people at once. They contained libraries, gardens, exercise grounds, lecture halls, food stalls, and shops. People went daily, not to get clean and leave, but to spend the afternoon there. Entry cost very little, and was sometimes free entirely, paid for by an emperor or a wealthy citizen seeking popularity, which meant that a laborer and a senator might use the same building on the same day, undressed. That is unusual, and Romans noticed it themselves. The baths were one of the few genuinely shared spaces in a rigidly hierarchical society, and the water itself was an enormous engineering commitment, sustained across centuries. Aqueducts carried water into cities from distant sources, sometimes across many kilometers of arched stone. Underground furnaces heated floors and walls through hollow spaces, warming entire rooms from beneath. A city would rather build an aqueduct than go without this. That tells you what it meant to them. So walk through the process, because it explains how cleaning worked without any soap at all. You began with exercise. Wrestling, ball games, lifting weights in an open courtyard. The point was to work up a heavy sweat, and the sweat was not incidental. It was step one. Sweat, along with warmth, loosens the greasy layer on the skin and opens everything up. Then you moved through rooms of increasing heat, ending in a chamber hot enough to be genuinely uncomfortable. More sweating, more loosening. The skin softened, and everything sitting on it began to lift. Then came the oil, poured on, rubbed in thoroughly, worked across the whole body, often scented, and the scent mattered enormously, because smelling right was a large part of what clean meant. The fresh oil mixed with the old oil, the sweat, and everything trapped in them. Then the strigil, dragged across the skin in firm strokes, scraping the entire mixture off. Wealthy people had this done for them by an attendant, who worked systematically across the body. What came off was a gray paste of oil, sweat, dust, and dead skin, wiped from the blade as it accumulated. And here is a detail that says everything about how differently they understood dirt. That scraped off residue was collected, and it had a market. It was sold. It was used as a medicinal preparation, and the residue from famous athletes commanded high prices. Sit with that for a moment, because it is genuinely difficult for a modern person to absorb. The stuff scraped off a sweating body was not waste. It was a product with value attached to its source. Nobody thought of it as contaminated, because contamination in our sense did not exist as a concept. After the scraping came the water, warm pool, then cool, then often a cold plunge to finish. And the result was a person who was, by any reasonable standard, thoroughly clean. The grease was gone. The dead skin was gone. The dirt was gone. They smelled of perfume. This system worked, and it worked for centuries, across an enormous empire. So did Romans know about soap at all? Yes, clearly and explicitly. Roman writers describe it, and they attribute it to the Gauls and the Germanic peoples to the north. It is treated as a foreign product, associated with barbarians, and slightly exotic. And the use they describe is not washing the body. It was applied to hair as a treatment, specifically to lighten or redden it, which was fashionable at various points and required something alkaline. So soap enters the Roman world as a cosmetic, arriving through a completely different door from hygiene, which is one of the strangest facts in this whole story and worth stating plainly. For centuries, the most bathing-obsessed civilization in the ancient Mediterranean used soap on its hair and not its skin. Now, why not? They had it available. They were clearly not squeamish about experimenting with their appearance. Part of the answer is harshness. Early soaps were rough, and Roman skincare was heavily oil-based and gentle. Part of it is that the existing system genuinely worked, and there was no visible problem to solve. People do not replace a functioning method with an unfamiliar one for no reason. And part of it is cultural. Bathing was social, performative, and deeply tied to identity as a civilized person. Oil and the strigil were part of what it meant to be Roman, in the way particular customs always are. Adopting a barbarian product for the central ritual would have felt not merely odd, but slightly wrong. But the deepest reason is the one we keep returning to, and it underlies all the others. Nobody was trying to remove invisible organisms, because nobody knew there were any. Clean meant free of visible dirt, free of bad smell, and appropriate to your social position. Soap is only obviously superior once you decide that the goal is removing something you cannot see. Against the visible dirt standard, oil and a scraper perform perfectly well, sometimes better. So soap remained where it had always been. In workshops, on wool, in medicine, and on hair. It kept being made and traded and improved quietly at the edge of daily life. Over the following centuries, the craft advanced considerably, particularly around the Mediterranean. Soap makers learned to work with olive oil rather than animal fat, producing something far milder. They learned to use particular plant ashes that gave a cleaner, more predictable result. Regions with abundant olive oil developed reputations for quality that lasted for centuries. Scholars in the medieval Islamic world wrote detailed technical treatises on the process and its variations. Hard soaps, scented soaps, colored soaps, recipes recorded with real precision. And washing itself was structured into daily religious life through required ritual purification. So by this point, soap is a mature technology, made well, and available in quantity. Everything necessary for a bar of soap in every bathroom already exists. The chemistry is solved, and still, for most people in most places, it is not what you use on your body every day. Which brings us to the real question underneath this entire story, the one the chemistry cannot answer. Not how do you make soap? That was solved before writing. The question is why anybody would use it on themselves, routinely, when water already feels sufficient. And to answer that, you have to look at what people actually believed dirt was. Because for almost all of history, dirt was not a substance. Dirt was a condition. Look at ritual washing across unconnected societies, and one thing stands out immediately. It is everywhere. Washing before prayer. Washing before entering a temple. Washing before touching sacred objects or approaching a shrine. Washing after contact with a corpse. After childbirth. After illness. After anything marked as dangerous. These practices appear in societies with no contact with each other, on different continents, in different centuries, which suggests they are solving a problem that every human group encounters and needs an answer to. Now notice what these moments have in common, because the pattern is precise rather than vague. Almost none of them is about visible dirt. A person can be spotless and still require washing. They are about crossing a line between ordinary and sacred, between life and death, between outside and inside. Washing is how you mark the crossing. It is a boundary made physical, performed with your own hands. And that is a genuinely useful thing to have, quite apart from anything to do with germs. It tells you when a state has changed. It gives a group a shared signal that everyone can see and verify. So water becomes the universal solvent for categories rather than for substances. And once you see it that way, a great deal that looks superstitious turns out to be quietly rational. Because many of these rules track real danger with surprising accuracy, without anyone knowing why. Wash after handling a body. Wash after illness. Wash before eating. Wash after using a latrine. Every one of those is excellent advice, and every one of them was followed for entirely the wrong reason, which is worth pausing on, because it is the most interesting thing in this entire subject. A rule can be correct in its effects and wrong in its explanation, and still protect people for thousands of years. The explanation is what gets remembered and argued about. The behavior is what actually saves lives. So the ancient world was not ignorant about washing. It washed a great deal, at specified times, with real seriousness. What it lacked was a reason to wash with a manufactured substance rather than with water. If dirt is a condition, water resolves it. If dirt is a substance, you need something that removes substances, and nothing forced that second view for a very long time, because there was no visible evidence for it. Then several things changed at once, and it took a genuine catastrophe to start the process. Cities grew far larger than anything the ancient world had built, and grew faster than their infrastructure. Enormous numbers of people living in dense conditions, with water supplies sitting close to waste. And with that came epidemic disease at a scale and speed that demanded an explanation. The prevailing theory for a long period held that disease traveled through foul air, carried by smell. Bad odors from decay, waste, and stagnant water were understood as the actual mechanism of infection. This was wrong, and it was also, in practice, remarkably productive, because it pointed straight at filth. Clean the streets, remove the waste, ventilate the buildings, wash everything. Enormous sanitation projects followed, driven by a theory that had the mechanism completely backwards, and they worked. Disease rates fell substantially, for reasons nobody involved fully understood at the time. Then, in the 19th century, the actual answer arrived, and it changed the meaning of dirt permanently. Microorganisms. Living things too small to see, present on surfaces, on hands, in water, and capable of causing disease. One of the earliest and most striking demonstrations came from a maternity hospital, and it is worth telling. A physician noticed that mothers in one ward died at dramatically higher rates than in another. The difference was that doctors in the first ward came directly from performing autopsies to delivering babies. He required them to wash their hands in a chemical solution before entering, and deaths fell sharply. He could not explain the mechanism and had no theory to offer, and his colleagues largely rejected him. He was proposing that respectable physicians were carrying death on their hands, which was an insult as much as a claim. He was right, and vindication came only after his death, once germ theory supplied the missing explanation. And once that explanation existed, the meaning of clean was rewritten entirely in a single generation. Dirt was no longer a condition to be resolved. Dirt was a population of living things to be removed, which changes everything about the requirements in a way that had never applied before. You can no longer trust your eyes, because the thing you are removing is invisible by definition. You can no longer trust your nose, because the dangerous material has no reliable smell. Looking clean and being clean have separated permanently, and only a procedure can bridge the gap. And now, for the first time in the entire history of the species, soap has an obvious argument. Because water cannot lift a greasy film off skin, and that film is exactly where microbes sit. Soap wraps it, lifts it, and carries the whole population away down the drain. A 4,000-year-old technology suddenly acquires a purpose it was never designed for, and the timing works out with almost suspicious convenience. Industrial manufacturing had by then made soap cheap, uniform, and mild enough for daily use on skin. Piped water was reaching ordinary homes in growing numbers, making frequent washing practical rather than laborious. Public health campaigns, schools, and manufacturers pushed hand washing relentlessly until it became automatic. Within a few generations, an act that had been optional for all of human history became invisible habit, not a ritual anyone thinks about, not a decision, something you do without noticing you have done it, which is the final stage of any successful technology and the point at which it stops being visible at all. And it means the bar in your bathroom is doing something nobody who invented it could have imagined. So return to the gap, because it is the strangest thing in this story and it deserves a proper answer. For 1,000 years between having soap and using it on ourselves. Not for want of chemistry. The recipe never changed in any fundamental way. Fat, ash, water. The same reaction, the same molecule. What changed was the question people were asking when they washed. Ask, am I pure? And water answers perfectly. Ask, do I smell right? And oil and perfume answer perfectly. Ask what is physically on my hands right now, and suddenly nothing but soap will do. The technology sat and used for millennia because nobody had asked the third question, and this pattern is not unique to soap. It is one of the most common shapes in the history of invention. Things get invented long before anyone works out what they are for, and then wait, not for better engineering, for a change in what people believe the world is made of, which means the bottleneck in human progress is often not capability. It is imagination about the problem. You cannot build a solution to a problem you have not conceived of, no matter what materials you have, and you will walk past the solution repeatedly if it is already sitting in the workshop doing something else. Now here is the part that should be slightly uncomfortable, and I want to be careful with it. You wash your hands because of germ theory. You believe that, and it is true in one sense. But ask yourself honestly whether you are thinking about microorganisms when you do it. You are not. Almost nobody is. You do it because it is what you do, and not doing it feels wrong. You feel dirty, and washing resolves the feeling, and the feeling arrives long before any reasoning does, which is, structurally, precisely what the Egyptian priest was doing 4,000 years ago. A physical act performed at prescribed moments, which resolves a sense of contamination that is largely felt rather than reasoned. The explanation underneath it has changed completely. The behavior has barely changed at all, and you can test this on yourself with an example that has nothing to do with hygiene. Handle something disgusting but entirely harmless, and you will want to wash immediately. Handle something genuinely dangerous but not disgusting, and the urge is far weaker or absent. Your washing instinct is not tracking risk. It is tracking a much older category of contamination. Germ theory did not replace that instinct. It was layered on top of it and given the credit, which is not a criticism, because the outcome is good. The habit protects people regardless of the reasoning behind it. Hand washing remains one of the most effective health measures ever adopted, at almost no cost. But it is worth knowing that the ancient logic is still running underneath the modern one. So look at the bar in your bathroom one final time and consider what it actually is. Older than writing. Invented for wool. Used as medicine. Applied to hair by people who bathed daily and never touched it. Ignored by the greatest bathing culture of the ancient world, which had a better answer for the problem it understood. Sitting quietly in workshops for thousands of years, waiting for a question nobody had thought to ask, and then, in the space of a few generations, becoming so ordinary that you cannot imagine a house without it. Nothing about the substance changed. Everything about what we thought we were doing changed, which leaves the thing worth carrying out of this, and it applies well beyond soap. The tools available to a society are rarely the limit. The limit is what that society believes is going on. There were 4,000 years of people with soap in the building, washing in plain water, feeling perfectly clean, and they were not stupid. They were answering the question they had, correctly, with the best method available, which raises an uncomfortable thought about us. What is already sitting in the workshop right now waiting?